Hello, everybody, and welcome to Talk Nerdy to Me. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining today. As I'm always fond of saying, you could be anywhere in the world and you're here with us. And for that, I really appreciate you. So for those of you who are not familiar with Talk Nerdy, this is an ongoing series that we produce here at Thinkingbox, also in partnership with our sister agency, Antisocial, where we talk about creative technology, we talk about the world at large, we talk about content, technology, creative design. It's all up here on the screen, and we try to discuss it all at least once a month. So if you want to get nerdy, you are in the right place. We are about to get very nerdy today. We are really excited to present to you something that we over on Team Strategy have been working on for the past few months. And well, before I get too much into it, I'm going to first introduce you to the larger team. So first and foremost, welcome to Uncertain Times. Today on the call, you have myself. I'm Helen Androlia. I'm the Director of Strategy over at Thinkingbox. So we have not yet an opportunity to meet. It is nice to meet you. Thank you for coming to join us. Also joining me today, I have two senior strategists on my team. We have the formidable Erin Dafos, who is a tactician wizard who's all about that back-end journey. So if you're looking for somebody to understand how people flow in from that first insight to the moment that they click through to make a purchase, that's why we have an Erin. And then we also have the fantastic Jasmine Bulgin, who is a super smart content expert who comes from a strong social background. She's worked on great big brands and small brands alike. And we are all here to talk to you today a little bit about uncertain times. Now, I recognize that this term might be a little triggering for some people. We've spent the past year talking about uncertainty, right? That we live in uncertain times. And so we're happy to present to you today some work that we've done. First and foremost, we're going to take you through team strategy. I've already done that. That's my bad. I'm used to having my slides off to the other side, so my apologies. We're also going to talk a little bit about why uncertainty is important and why talking about uncertain times at this point in our world and at large is an important thing for us to be doing. We're also going to be taking you through the result of the past 3 months of this research. We're going to be taking you something that we're calling through the uncertainty lens. And with that being said, if you're going, what is this and what is this about? Well, that's great because Jasmine is going to take you through how it works and how you can apply it to your own work. And then, of course, because we understand that not everybody is focused in a communication sense, not everybody is writing briefs like we are, we also have external applications. And Erin's going to be giving you some insight into how this can be used for more than just advertising and communications principles, because we recognize that it's more than that. And then, of course, we're going to open it up to you for a Q&A, because hopefully you have Qs and hopefully we'll have As. So with that being said, here, I've already introduced you to us a little bit, but there's our faces, just in case you can't see us on the screen. That is what we look like. And with that being said, without further ado, we're going to go into why uncertainty is important. Now, we chose this term, as I said, because we spent the past year and a half listening to a lot of communications that say, in these uncertain times. And the fact is, we're still living in uncertain times. You know, even with the advent of vaccines and vaccine passports, which came out today, I know a point of hot contention, but we're not here to debate that over in the chat. The fact is, we're always living in uncertain times. We can sit there and say that we can predict or that we believe that something is going to happen. But the fact is, we never know what's going to come next. And I think the past year and a half has really demonstrated that to us. We still don't know what's going to happen next. And we're still in a place where I feel that many of us are feeling cautiously optimistic, but at the same time, feeling that we can't necessarily stick a stake into the ground as to where we feel right now. And one of the things that we noticed around this in particular is the stress of the past year and a half. And I use that very specifically. We could call it anxiety, we could call it anger. There's a number of different feelings that we're going through, most of which are not entirely positive, but ultimately it all adds up to stress. And stress has changed us. Stress does change us. This is not just something that we're saying for the sake of conversation. This is also something that we're saying because studies show that exposure to long-term stress actually does rewire how we think. It causes us to become a little less flexible, a little bit less able to think outside of our own experiences. We tend to rely on things that we know or understand. And right now, in a world where things that we know and understand are things that we have a hard time grasping, when you add the stress of the unknown, when you add the stress of what could potentially happen next to this notion that there are many things that we turn and look to rely on, we feel that this is something that has marked us somehow. What the result of that looks like, we don't know, but we know it will continue to. And one of the things that we noticed was that we were seeing responses, particularly on social media, where you would see individuals, groups even, responding to the same communication in very drastically different ways. Like these were clearly groups that were part of the same demographics. And therefore, you would assume that they would have similar responses, but we were seeing really large binary opposite reactions where some people were very positive, some people were incredibly negative, and that people would often flip back and forth. And we wanted to ask, what is causing this space in between? What is making it so that all of a sudden these communications that we feel are reassuring or will work or we're kind, we're causing people to have this interpretation? Well, knowing that stress has this impact on us, we also know that it means that our ability to interpret information and to think outside of our immediate experience becomes limited. So how we judge risk has also changed too. And so we wanted to ask, knowing that we're still trying to speak to our same targets, we're still trying to communicate similar ideas, we're also trying to be empathetic, we're trying to be sensible, we wanted to ask ourselves, is there a way in which we could potentially generalize these changes to us as individuals in the same way that we generalize a target demographic? Is there some way that we could apply a principle so we could take a step back and say, knowing that these individuals are still who they are, their occupations, potentially their residence, their family situations are still potentially the same, knowing that we can't evolve our targets in that way, is there something that we can do so that we can create a more acute and accurate understanding of not only what their experiences may have been, but how the result of that long-term exposure to stress may have changed them? Now, we don't know if this is something that we can do as a certainty, but we do believe it is a possibility. And the result of which is what we're going to share with you today. So for everybody who's participating, I want to be very clear. What we're trying to do in the next 45 minutes, half an hour, is summarize what is essentially a very substantial white paper with a tool at the center of it, including a lot of research, into a very brief period of time. And so if you're like wondering what it is that we're talking about, that is absolutely okay. Everybody who signed up through Eventbrite will be getting an email after the webinar today, where you can download the white paper for yourself, where we outline our methodology in far more detail. We also outline our groups, our archetypal groups, into much more detail. But for today, we really wanted to talk about how and why we built it and how we think it can be applied. And then, of course, for everybody who's joining us from the internal team from Thinkingbox, hi, everybody, just let me know. I'm going to drop something for you in the Slack. So with that being said, let's go into uncertain times. So we wanted to look first at those external behaviors. Why does this matter? And why does this add up to this? One, we wanted to look at how we approach and how we cope, right? Coping mechanisms show us what we need to get through something. When we're looking for how we self-soothe, that demonstrates something to us about what we need. The other thing that we also wanted to look at was another external behavior, this notion of a cultural response. Again, when we're looking at the same message and seeing these really different responses to it, this really gives us an idea of where individuals are focusing their energy. We can also look at other cultural elements and events that were happening around it. For instance, the enormous rise of OnlyFans that came out of a number of individuals looking for ways to supplement their income while they were dealing with the uncertainty of their day-to-day jobs, as an example. We can also look at large cultural movements like Black Lives Matter. These things don't happen in a vacuum, right? And so ultimately where we focus our energy shows us something about individuals as well. And the other thing that we think is really important to analyze through this lens of uncertainty is this idea of how we've changed, right? We now have new habits. It takes about 90 days to make or break a habit. And so previous to COVID, we were really looking at how do we feed into people's habits and routines to either augment or disrupt. And now that we're looking at a whole new system of habits and things that our people are accustomed to, this gives us an idea of how we have changed as a group. And so having this lens to help us understand what we needed, where we focused, and how we've changed, we think will be a really key part of helping us understand our targets in a more empathetic and actionable way going forward. So I'm going to take you through how we built out the uncertainty lens. So these are built on 12 different archetypes. These archetypes range from someone like the resetter, an individual who is like a ball in a cannon ready to shoot out. They just want to get forward, they want to move on, or more specifically, they like to go back to the way things were. All the way to a group like the doubter, a person for whom, for lack of a better way of putting it, they no longer trust like that. Everything has a question attached to it. Nothing feels safe or certain. We also have groups that we see day to day, Groups like the negotiator, an individual who feels that there is needs for compromise, not just how we compromise in society and how we move through it, but also for their own impact. Right? That ultimately COVID wasn't entirely negative, and therefore there are some aspects that they've built into their life that they want to keep with them. All of these are outlined in far greater detail. So if it feels as if I'm only touching on these lightly, it's only because there's a much larger body of work to it. But ultimately, this was the result of these. And so we began developing these archetypes by making 4 core assumptions. The first one was that we have all experienced stress, regardless of how good we may or may not have it. I'm sure there's many of you who have heard the term working from home means that you have work and therefore you have a home, and also that that is good. And it is good, but it doesn't change the fact that we have still experienced stress. Uncertainty, anxiety, these things level up to making us feel a certain way. And even for those of us who do not believe in the impacts of COVID, the severity of it, even those still who talk about the notion of whether or not a vaccine works, these are still individuals who are also experiencing stress, potentially even more so. Ultimately, for those of us who believe that we need to do our part, there is a stress exchange with the limitations we put on ourselves, but there is a compromise attached to it. For those of us who didn't necessarily understand that or relate to that, and again, I don't want to debate the nature of that, this could potentially cause even more stress. But as a result, over a year and a half, that means that we have also all changed. We've changed our habits, we've changed our point of view, we view the world in a different way. And as a result, too, we also have new needs. So it used to be that our value system, the way in which we would determine real value for a client consumer target, those things have shifted. Right? Our needs have become potentially more home-based, more cozy, or they may have become more elemental, more survival focused. They may also be more about planning than ever before. But the fact is we have new needs, and that means also that we don't know what's next. And I think that's a really key thing to underline. One of the things that we've discussed a lot is what are the long-term impacts of that? And as it is, we don't really have any evidence to show on a scale like this when we're looking at a global event that has affected everyone, regardless of demographic or income and ability to work. We still are not out the other side yet. And so the long-term impacts of this are something that's very difficult for us to measure. So we really wanted to take these 4 core assumptions to ground something in who people are now and take guesses, educated guesses, as to what that means going forward. We also want to consider 4 ways to measure and consider potential impact. Again, knowing that we can't predict the future. We wanted to look first at the factor of eustress versus de-stress, or in other words, negative and positive stress. Now, what's key about this is there's a lot of debates about whether or not eustress, positive stress, is a real thing, right? That ultimately all stress is bad because all stress causes us to have the same physiological and emotional responses. But ultimately, we wanted to look at that notion of de-stress in the fight, flight, freeze mechanism. Oh, that's always a hard thing to say. Or to look at it in the positive, right? That notion of using stress as a way to push yourself or propel yourself forward. We also wanted to look at the focus of our stress. Where do we turn our attention? How do we pull our energy forward? We then wanted to look at hesitancy or uncertainty. So in other words, how secure do people feel now? Because that would also give us an idea of what they need from brands going forward. And then finally, looking at a variety of coping mechanisms to try and see if we could find one-to-one applications. Because again, what we choose to self-soothe tells us what people need. So when we put all this together, we hope that this provides a lens into how people think, feel, and how they've changed. In other words, what we felt. So our stress response and our focus of our stress shows us what we were feeling over the past year and a half. How we feel to us is manifesting those levels of hesitation. How confident do people feel going forward? And then finally, what we need. So looking at those coping mechanisms and looking for a need state or a new set of values that come through that. And throughout every stage of the process, we did also seek out professional qualification. So we worked with individuals who were trauma-informed therapists, mental health professionals, psychiatrists, and social workers, and individuals who graciously granted us their time, considering the impact they've been under as well. But we wanted to make sure that at every single stage, because we couldn't reflect back on similar one-to-one equivalency research, that we were being backed up by professionals who see the impacts and see how this comes to life, and that what we were suggesting as solutions could potentially work. So what we first wanted to look at was this notion of how we felt, what we saw, our focus. So first we looked to those external facing behaviors. First, we wanted to qualify it first as the surviving. So I'm a person who's moving day to day. I just want to get through. I just want to make it through. I just have to get through this day, this week, this month. Then there's such a thriving, being able to plan for the future, being able to see a little bit further, having hope or optimism, or at the very least, a sense of reassurance. We then also wanted to consider individualism versus collectivism. And I want to be very clear that in this process, we don't have any judgment values attributed to any of this. For people who are very self-focused, they're focusing on their friends, their family, their immediate circle. These are often individuals who are very overwhelmed by scale, right? There's so much suffering, there's so much pain in the world and so many challenges. I, as an individual, can't help that. I can't move that needle, right? So I need to focus on the elements that I can control and I can change. Or on the other side, when we look at a collective focused individual, we often think of this person as being, again, inherently positive. There's no judgment attached to this. This is also a person who, yes, wants to turn their attention towards others, but often it's because focusing on their own individual circumstances feels overwhelming. Again, that notion of, you don't like working from home? Well, you work and you have a home, right? It feels very difficult for us to talk about our own feelings or the pressures and the isolation that we feel when we know that there are other people who are impacted heavier than we are. The other thing that we also wanted to consider, but haven't built into these archetypes, is the notion of resiliency and trauma, because ultimately those are key factors, but difficult for us to even understand. They're not forward-facing, presenting activities or behaviors. Ultimately, those are things that are wholly individual. There are many people, for instance, for whom this is one of the most traumatizing events of their lives, but they are remarkably resilient. Or for other individuals, this may not rank, but they're maybe not as prepared. Again, we don't want to attribute judgment, and we can't really say, but ultimately, this is how we first started building these archetypes. Then from that focus, what we saw is that we ended up with 4 designated groups. These are wide scale behaviors. And again, in the white paper, we show a lot of evidence to these individuals and how they come together, but this framed the initial archetype building. So first we have our group of pushers. We call them that because they're inspired by the saying, if you're going through hell, just keep going, just keep pushing, just make it through to the other side. These are individuals who are trying to make ends meet. These are our individually focused survivalists. Right. On the other hand, that we have our adapters, the people who just want to roll with it. I can be adaptable. I can handle this. I can take this. I'm going to make the best of a bad situation. And then when we look at our collectively focused individuals, we have our agonizers. These are people who are hand wringers. And again, no judgments, because we need these individuals. These are the people who raise their hand, who say that they're worried. These are people who are here to make us think, to remind us that there's more than just our own individual experiences. And then we have our helpers. Those were also inspired by favorite Mr. Rogers. When times are hard, look for the helpers. These are individuals who want to make us act. They're collectively focused individuals. We can overcome this. We can work together. None of us are smarter than all of us. So once we had these 4 groups together, we then wanted to look at that notion of hesitancy, uncertainty, anxiety. And so there's a number of studies that are coming out. So everybody has different variations, but ultimately what we've leaned on is IMI's Next Wave reports. Again, in the white paper, there are resources. You can go and check them out for yourself. But they've been doing every 3 months a fantastic survey, getting people's opinions. And one of the things that we saw was that there's a really sort of not clear division, but a relatively distributed point of view about hesitancy. About 20% feel that we're not moving fast enough. We need to be quicker. We need to move and be more adaptable. Then we also have 30%, 32%. We're moving too fast. Are we certain? Are we good? We need to put the brakes on. We need to slow down. And then those in the middle that have an appropriate speed, which felt like a very clear cut way of looking at it. But we also wanted to ask a couple of key questions. For our agonizer group, for those who are really worried about others and the collective good, why would this group be concerned that we weren't moving fast enough? This felt to me and the rest of the team like a group that would actually want us to move a little bit faster. On the other hand, when we were looking at our pushers, the ones who wanted to make it out through to the other side, or our adapters, those who felt nimble and that they could roll with it, why would these 2 groups be concerned that we were moving too quickly or too carelessly? This to us felt like groups that wouldn't want to put the brakes on. And then in the middle, with our appropriate speed, what we felt was really important in this was the question of how would each of these groups interpret appropriate speed? So what we worked through was an empathy exercise, ways of articulating these feelings of hesitancy around re-entering back into a post-COVID society through the perspective of each of these, and something that felt real and simple and grounded in reality. Again, I won't take you through all of it today. But what we found as a result was that there were these expressions that we felt needed qualification. And as I mentioned previously, there's no real study to show something on this scale that has impacted such a wide breadth of society. We really haven't been through something so collectively large since World War II. And even then, we didn't really have the psychological language, the vocabulary to talk about things like post-traumatic stress disorder or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And we certainly weren't doing studies on this kind of scale. So we wanted instead to look to how could we ground this in some study or some reality that was done over long-term behavior analysis, something that was about a large-scale event that didn't necessarily have a singular focus or a singular villain, so to speak, where lots of individuals were affected and anxiety was a large factor in it. And so what we looked to were a number of studies done on Cold War nations and looking at how teenagers matured into adults and how they adapted and coped after growing up under a threat of a nuclear holocaust. And one of the things that we discovered in this was that there was Bond's defense style questionnaire, which is a large scale question system around helping people understand how they cope with stress. And as a result, there is approximately 40 different subtypes, and they're all built out from Freud's basics of coping mechanisms, which have approximately 20 different focuses. Now, we wanted to move away from Freud, and we also wanted to move away from naming these because, again, we don't want an attributable value system. And the original version of the systematic analysis of coping mechanisms have a lot to do with terms like neuroses or psychoses. And these are things that we are not interested in talking about because, one, it feels very judgmental. And two, we are not mental health professionals and we are not here to diagnose anybody. But what we did find is that when we started pulling out those terms and we started removing those qualifications, we could actually see a one-to-one between our empathetic exercises and actually how they could be re-articulated into coping mechanisms. And so what we wanted to do was consider how we could frame that. We looked instead from going from neurotic or healthy, because again, we don't want to have those terms attached, to conscious. So I'm making a conscious choice to handle my stress. I'm consciously meditating or doing yoga or going for a walk or putting my energy somewhere, versus the unconscious. I don't know why I can't sit still. I don't know why I can't stop watching The Office, but that's all I want to do right now. And then that notion of variable, because depending on the scenario, we can be very conscious in how we manage our energy. We can also be very unconscious in it. And so as an example, because again, we don't want to name things specifically, we can look at a term like regression. And so often, when we think about regression, it's this idea of returning back to a childlike state. And this is an expression for a need for security. I need to feel safe. I need to go back to a place where I felt like the world was less complicated. At its best, it's wearing a onesie, eating ice cream every day for dinner, and watching The Office from start to finish. Relatable content, I'd like to think. At its worst, it is throwing an on the floor temper tantrum at a grocery store because there's something that you want that isn't available, right? Either way, we're not trying to judge these, right? But there are lots of equivalents that we see. So for instance, sublimation, the idea of taking negative energy or negative stress and pouring it into something positive and winning the best of a bad situation. Even altruism is considered to be a coping mechanism, right? I feel a certain way right now, but I want to make sure something good comes out of it that affects a greater good. And so when we looked at all of that and put that together, we ended up with this monster. This is not helpful for literally anybody. So instead, what we wanted to do was take it and turn it into something that was smaller, familiar, and much more digestible. We wanted to take this lens and make those archetypes. So when we were crafting those, after applying all those different areas to it, we wanted to make sure that they were immediately recognizable and familiar, that you could read these different archetypes and see yourself or see your friends and family in them. We wanted them to be relevant and applicable, right? In other words, this is also part of the reason why we didn't want to lead into this hyper negative or into the very extreme versions of the different coping mechanisms. We wanted it to be something that we could actually affect change for and something that we could actually see as relevant to our clients. We also wanted them to be demographic neutral, right? Because ultimately, Whether you happen to be a teenager who is studying from home, a university student who was expecting to start your first year and instead is doing everything through Zoom, whether you're colleagues and coworkers, parents, or single, we wanted these to be individuals that could be applied all over. And then finally, we also wanted to be directive and actionable, right? We wanted to have an outcome. We wanted to use these notions to say, if we know that people need this, then this is what we need to do going forward. So we ended up with three main groups. Our ready to go group. These are the ones who, again, have low hesitancy. They're ready to move on or move forward, whatever that means. It doesn't necessarily mean that we cast all, anxieties aside, that we act as if everything's normal, but that we are ready to move on. We also have our full stop, individuals for whom we are not ready to re-enter. They are not ready to re-enter. And they're frankly not interested in having those conversations and doing the best they can to maintain the normalcy that they've created for themselves over the past year and a half. And then in the middle, we have our step-by-step, our individuals who are making those compromises, who are working in those places in between. Ultimately, this is where all of these different archetypes come from, right? This notion of a low hesitancy group, people who want to move forward, get back to normal, change the world, or just go back to where it was. We also look at groups like the ones who sit in the middle, the ones for whom we feel like there's a little give and take, or that we can move forward, providing that we do certain things. And then finally, we get to those who have high hesitancy. And we don't think that they're necessarily a target or a group of archetypes that we should no longer speak to, but they do have unique and specific needs. Individuals who feel that the way things have been established for them over the past year and a half work, even if the rest of the world is changing. So with that in mind, we took the lens, we tried to apply it into a tool we felt was simple and digestible. We used a very basic user experience lens model to help us understand. The notion of does, says, feels, thinks, and we added one more element to it, seeks. What are they looking for? So in other words, what are their actions and priorities now? How do they behave? Where do they focus their energy? How do they express their state now? When someone says, how are you? Are they honest? Do they speak about it? What do they talk about? What's their emotional relationship to the world? As I mentioned before about when we're talking about the notion of trauma and resiliency, there are many people for whom on the surface, they seemed as if they were well equipped to handle what was happening, but they may have lost their faith in humanity. They may have lost their belief in the systems that we have created for us. How do they now feel about other people? And how do they view the world now? And how do they view their role in it? Do they feel that they have a purpose? Do they feel that they have a place? Do they feel that they can trust others, that they can trust our leadership? And as a result, what are their needs and values today? How can we adapt to that? And so we also went through and created a lexicon. Again, this is also in the white paper, where when we're creating briefs, we're trying to understand, add this lens to our demographic targets. These are the things that we need to communicate. Things like affirmation, your feelings are valid. Your feeling of uncertainty, your anxiety, or even your feeling that you want to get back out and get back to normal, that is valid. You are okay for feeling like that. Or things like solutions. How are we helping and how are we helping you? Can we create solutions for you? When we're looking at things like action, how can you move? Or what are we doing to move you forward? How are we providing things for you? And then we have progression. What are we doing? What are the steps we are putting in place? But all of these are elements that are designed to solve the needs that we've determined through these coping mechanisms. And we believe that these are essential to helping us understand who our targets are now. So once we take all of this and we put this all together, this complex thing, how does it work to help us better understand our targets? So with that being said, I'm going to put myself on mute and pass it over to Jasmine, who's going to give you an example of how the lens can be applied to a target demographic.
Thank you. So yes, let's go ahead and put it to the test. How can a brand use this lens to speak to their existing target groups? So for the purposes of this exercise, our client will be a unisex fashion retailer that specializes in denim, and it's mid-priced everyday wear with a little bit of dressier options and accessories as well. They're primarily located in shopping malls or strip malls across Canada, and they tend to be outside the downtown core. Their target is family-oriented Canadians. They skew male, and they'll usually be between the age of 25 and 40. So the client came to us with an ask, and their ask is that they find that their brick and mortar stores, now that they've reopened, the uptake has been pretty slow. They really want to bring back their employees to work. They want to hire the great people that have been working with them before the pandemic, and they really want to reestablish the store to consumer connection that they've been able to have with their consumers. So their question is, how do we re-engage pre-pandemic consumers and get them comfortable enough to come back inside? So we take a look at their existing target, and their primary target group is the Cyrus. So he's in his mid-30s, he's divorced, a father of 2. He lives in Thunder Bay, Ontario, making between 70 to 85K a year, working in the trades. He doesn't shop that often, so he shops more seasonally, but when he does shop, he spends a lot. So he really wants to get his whole wardrobe. He's usually in and out, and like a guy shopping, in and out, wanting to get everything he needs and just get out of there. He has shopped both online and in store, skewing in store for convenience. So adjusting to e-commerce was not that big of a deal during COVID for him. So we want to consider why this brand wants to get him back in store. And when you consider that the brand identity was built on the in-store experience, that's their main idea. And we also found that this target's basket size was actually smaller throughout the past 18 months when he was shopping online than when he came in store. And what they found was that they kind of missed that opportunity to upsell this target. Their employees were really good at upselling and talking through the consumer needs. So they really wanted to get him back in for that opportunity. They're also really rebuilding their e-commerce, and they really want to be competitive in that area before they let go of that section. So based on our target, we identified 4 main areas that we want to focus on to figure out what archetype we should be using. So we focused on the location. So it's exurban, rural. So they would be affected by COVID, by localized outbreaks, but not necessarily often touched closely by it. His age. So he's personally low risk, but he does have children who are underage, so can't be vaccinated. And his parents would also be in a higher risk age group. His job. So he's still working throughout the pandemic, lucky enough to keep his job, but a lot of his clients have not. So he will have seen business slow down. And then we also considered his family status. So he's divorced with shared custody. So he will be seeing a lot of his children in his home. And again, they've not been vaccinated. So based on what we know, we came up with 3 main archetypes that would live within this target. We have the David archetype, who is the challenger. David falls into the challenger archetype. He's over it. His region has been so close to recovery so many times, and it's actually infuriating to him when a careless outbreak shuts everything down again, especially when it's not that close to him. It's an outbreak somewhere where some people are being careless, and his community is trying so hard to build back together. People are losing their jobs, they're struggling, and he's seeing this, and it's frustrating. He's the guy that is going out to his local shops and trying to keep people's spirits up. He's the support local guy. He really just wishes that everyone could see the logic of coming together so that we could end this. And then we have our Mark. He's the apprehender. So he's not trying to rush back to what would be considered normal. He wants to wait till we actually have things figured out. He sees his kids and his kids' friends are the ones who are actually suffering with the constant uncertainty. He's actually frustrated that his kids are having to go back to school wearing masks all day. Is it too soon is what he's kind of questioning. So what's the real difference between last year and this year? If the kids are still unvaccinated, they need to go into school with masks. What's the difference? Why did they have to be pulled out last year and why can they go this year? So he's more on, can we focus on safety? And then we have Harris, who's the negotiator. So he really found his groove in the past 18 months, and he's gained some new habits that he's excited about. And he's primarily very happy that he was able to spend a lot more time with his kids during the pandemic, able to watch them grow. He's also spent more time in the community, getting to know local businesses, finding hidden treasures. Plus, he's done all of his shopping online and really had no problem with it. He's found his fit. He's good finding the right size and fit, and he really just doesn't see the purpose to going back to in-store. So then we wanted to look at how these three archetypes who we would build within the target would come together. When they're put together, we find that these three groups really think of the group, of the collective. We need to come together to find a solution through this. They're cautious about going back to a new normal and anxious about what they don't know, about what's unseen outcomes. So when we speak to them, we want to speak to them with empathy, solutions, reassurance, and planning. So based on this, we recommend a way forward for our Cyrus target group. So to reach him, we really need to help him feel understood using empathy. We need to prove to him that you're actively working towards recovery, so the solutions and planning portion. And we need to let him know that he can and should trust you. We want to welcome him as a participant in the process. So we do that by being transparent. So we want to consider showing him behind the scenes. What are your safety implementation? Give him a look, give him an inside gaze at what you're doing. He understands the struggle of local businesses too. So be the local business, show off your employees that are coming back to work and really excited to serve him. Secondly, we want to ease him in. So entice him back with unique experiences. So you can offer small shopping parties between kind of off hours. We know that he likes to be in and out when shopping. So he's probably forgotten the useful tips that he gets from the associates. So consider offering a seasonal shopping service where he doesn't have to browse the aisles, but would have custom looks made for him. Key into the hybrid shopping experience. We know he's enjoyed being online. So tie it back with the store benefit, things like in-store returns, custom exchanges. Show him that he can access the things from the old normal without necessarily hindering recovery efforts. That'll be important for these groups. Third, we want to relate. So be real. Don't be afraid to directly address how the pandemic has affected the way you view your business. And then again, try showing stories from real employees to add a personal touch to it because they'll relate to that. And then you want to show off your values. So people like Cyrus's mindset has really changed over the past 18 months, and that's not temporary. So they want to see that your business mindset in terms of the moving forward is also not temporary. We want to see flexibility in business as an ongoing thing. So let's bring this all back together. The client came to us wanting to know how to get their pre-pandemic consumer back in the store. Their target groups remain unchanged, but the pandemic has actually affected their mindset. So it follows that the old communications methods that they were using aren't going to work anymore. So we put their main target group through the lens, identified 3 archetypes, so that we can adjust the communications to better reach them in ways that they'd respond. So again, we're using empathy, in this case, solutions, planning, and reassurance. So for this brand in particular, it means exposing brand value, reestablishing trust with the clients, putting their own employees at the forefront of the business to establish empathy and connection. But also importantly, I would be implementing lasting changes that accommodate the Cyrus's new habits and mindsets. So firming up a hybrid shopping experience where he can easily enjoy the perks of in-store as well as online. Make it easy for him and make it known that we're not trying to change him, but in fact that we are growing with him as a brand. So with that, I will pass it on to Erin, who will talk through external applications.
Cool. Thanks, Jasmine. So yeah, as we were building this tool, we really started to see how this could be applied to a number of different industries and a number of different use cases. And so we actually think this really should apply outside of just marketing and communications, because we know that communications is a big portion of what a lot of people do. And so the question for us then became, how does it work as a tool to help us collectively understand our new societal challenges? So some of the considerations that we took into account here were, we really wanted to find opportunities for this to be used with people who have a lot of influence. And so by influence, what we mean is people who work in places or have opportunities to shift public opinions or public outcomes. And so some of the things that we took into consideration were, how is this applicable to the most and the least affected by the pandemic? I think we've all weathered the same storm, but maybe we're not in the same boat. So taking in that wide range of considerations here. The second is, how do we involve people whose main priority is one-to-one human connection or collaboration so that it kind of fosters better interpersonal relationships? And the last thing is, we wanted this to apply to a large variety of people in the uncertain times archetypes as well, so that people could really flex the muscle of this tool and be able to take in a lot of different perspectives. So as we were brainstorming, we came up with like a ton of different industries and opportunities for this to be applied. But for the sake of brevity, we really boiled it down to industries that fit into three main categories. One are people who are focused on rebuilding trust. The second is people who are serving the public. And then the third is our future planners. The next slide, thanks. So first, rebuilding trust. These are people who are very action orientated. And this group is people who really need to act in the best interests of others as a byproduct of their role in society or their occupation or the industry that they're in. So they're really trying to solve against a backlash, and they really need to create some harmonious collaborations. And so two internal applications here we saw were human resources and hiring managers and government communications. For our human resources and hiring managers, we understand that they're kind of going up against this giant, or it's called the great resignation, of people who are burnt out and stressed out from the working from home. They're challenging employers who are trying to force them back into the office before they feel comfortable doing it, or people who are just kind of pivoted and changed direction in their career. And so I think for them, understanding these different archetypes will really help them build better relationships with their existing employees and help strengthen retention, because they'll be able to take some of these various archetypes into consideration as they roll out new policies or new hybrid models. And also, I think, help with hiring as well, so they can attract new talent who feels comfortable working for another organization and starting from the ground up. The second is for government communications. So these are people who really work with rolling out health officials and rolling out massive communications. And so these are really people who need to kind of take into consideration the fact that a lot of people are focused on kind of trying to get to the truth of the matter. We can flip to the next slide. Perfect. The next is serving the public. So these are people who are focused on showing up every day for our collective survival, and they tend to be on the receiving end of a lot of difficult emotions, and their priority is really trying to get through the day and not take it personal. So the applicable industries here we saw were healthcare workers, customer service personnel, and educators and students. So I think healthcare workers and customer service personnel kind of relate to each other in a number of ways, because they're really tasked with they're kind of on the receiving end of some misplaced frustration. They've also been celebrated, and they're kind of dealing with a lot of difficult emotions. And I think that this tool can really help them not only understand themselves, but also understand the behaviors and some of the motivations behind the people that they're dealing with. So it creates a little bit of space, and it's not something that they necessarily take home with them. For our educators and our students, we see them as in a process right now of grieving. Students are really grieving those milestone achievements, the first day of high school or the last year of high school, for example. And educators are trying to, kind of bring education online, make it engaging, but they're also recognizing that students are really dealing with a lot as well, and maybe their behaviors aren't completely understood. So I think for them, learning for them to kind of cope with what they're grieving right now will help them relate to each other and strengthen better bonds amongst each other. And then our last group is our planning for the future group. So this group is a really interesting industry because I think that they're really focused on long-term goals and opportunities. And this is a really unique sector society that actually has an impact, a capacity to make a really big impact on the world. And so I think two applicable industries here are financial advisors and urban planners. So for our financial advisors, we've seen a lot of changes happen in the last 18 years with the economy and with market behaviors and retail investors and crypto. And I think that financial advisors are really trying to cope and adapt with these new customer bases and new ways of thinking. We've also know that there is the great wealth transfer that's happening over the next 10 years. And just to get dark for a minute here, COVID kind of gave us a jump start on that when we look at the number of people who've died in the US, for example. And so we're starting to see financial assets change hands at a more rapid rate than what we've normally seen. And so I think for them, for this audience, like taking into account their clients' behaviors and decision-making, this lens might help inform some of that. So they're helping their clients make better decisions. The second group is our urban planners. And these are people who are tasked with really understanding diversity in our cities, wrapping their head around how can we make density safe, because it's kind of a necessary evil. They're looking at our commuting and our green spaces and how do we adapt with this new normal now that we know that most of us are working from home, either full-time or on a hybrid model. And I think what they're really focused on right now is keeping up with growth, but also trying to do it in an equity model, understanding that there were some inequalities that were happening before COVID hit and before the pandemic that we want to shift and change away from, and problems that we're going to need to solve in the long term. And so I think one of these, as they're looking at these different city initiatives and replanning strategies, I think that taking into consideration how people are viewing the world and how people want to interact with their spaces and the cities and the types of environments that they want to live in, now that location isn't necessarily dependent on their work history or where they work, I think that's going to be an interesting thing that they're going to have to be thinking about and that this lens could definitely apply to. And so that brings us to the end of the presentation. So I'm going to hand it back to Helen for some Q&A.
Thank you, Erin. I know there's okay. So we have our first questions from Ben. Thanks, Ben. Can this be used for UX design or creative ideation? I would say absolutely. I mean, and again, Jasmine and Erin, jump in if you have things to add, but I think one of the ways in which we wanted to look at it was by using a simple UX tool in the first place was really about that idea of I mean, how do I put this? All things are brand, but also all things are user experience, right? That notion of, when Jasmine's touching on this hybrid model of in-store and out-of-store, e-commerce versus, how we purchase items now and delivery, et cetera. All these things, I think, are user experience, right? And ultimately, it may not necessarily be around the building of a site, but it certainly is part of it. And I think that in understanding how people move through an e-commerce experience, as an example, or a website, using this is just as useful. And I think using a familiar tool, because it does allow us to figure out what kind of information should we prioritize, as an example, or what is an individual seeking out, looking for when they go to a site. Again, when we're handing off from a communication standpoint to that last click before the purchase, I think using this to apply it in that way, absolutely. And I do believe that, yes, I think this can be used for creative ideation. I think there's a number of different ways in which you could look at it, because I think there's a lot of interesting applications for, again, how do we look at empathy? Is it just about what we say, or is it about what we do? Can we build an experience that's empathetic? Can we build a story that is empathetic or reassuring? We also think that, again, when we're looking at like not just individual targets, but cohorts, right? We start slicing and dicing our targets into really refined areas when it comes down to very specific digital targeting. How we use something like this to help us graduate or evolve the story, I think is a really interesting approach. I don't know if either of you wanted to add anything to that. Okay. So Jesse wants to know, how many data points or what kinds of data should I consider when I'm choosing an archetype? So Jasmine's the person who built out the archetype model and how it came to life. What would you recommend from a data point or kind of data point? Like what indicators would you look for in a target before you would select your archetypes?
In the target, I was looking towards enough commonalities. So how many commonalities within this target, and that affect the state of mind. So I came up with 4. I would probably look between 3 and 5, just to make sure that we can have enough of an educated information into how the target comes to thinking, so we can develop a thought process, so that we can put it together. When you mix together the location, the job, and the family status, this is kind of the thinking that they would go through. But if you were just thinking location and age, you probably would have less of a basis to develop a formulation on how someone starts to think through something as big as COVID. So certainly as many as you can pull out, it would be ideal, but I think somewhere between 3 and 5 is a nice sweet spot.
Yeah, I agree. I think also too, just to touch on that as well, it's like, and sorry, I'm yes-anding you. When we're looking also at things like, I think there's also definitely a possibility that you can look to the solution, like to the need first or the value first, and build your archetypes back from there as well, right? So for instance, there's a lot of data, Jesse, that suggests things that aren't necessarily tied to any one individual demographic. So for instance, in coming out of the US, for instance, and something like over 60% of people have either gained or lost weight. And again, that's a stress response, but to an average of about 28 pounds in either direction, which is approximately 3 dress sizes, right? So if we know that this is something that we're looking at as an example, and we can say that if 60% have seen dramatic body shifts as an example, then we can definitely say, okay, one of the solutions they may actually need, using Jasmine's client as an example, are things like new clothes. This is a solution that they need. And so we then could maybe potentially look at it and say, okay, knowing that then, among this group, what is the likelihood of unemployment or reliance on CURB, for instance, or stimulus packages in the States? I think you can work in the reverse as well. But yeah, I think any data point is you have to have at least one. But yeah, I'm going to yes and Jasmine, 3 to 5, sweet. More? Great. Oh. Okay. Oh, and Shay would like to know, what if you think your target is actually more than or less than 3 archetypes? Which I think, Erin, when we were talking earlier about like when Erin was building out her portion in the back end, she was attributing a lot of archetypes to a number of different categories. So Erin, how would you suggest if I say like, okay, I'm going to land on, folks, Shay is, if you haven't, she works in our human resources team. So Shay could say, I think that there's actually like 6 different Thinkingbox uncertain archetypes. How would you suggest she go about that?
Yeah, I think when I was categorizing some of them, there were like 9 to 10 of them. I would say that, probably looking at 6 and then seeing some commonalities amongst them, and trying to distill it down to, kind of like 3 archetypes would really appreciate this response. And these 3 archetypes would really appreciate, this kind of response into things. And so that way you can kind of group them in together a little bit and satisfy them, and make the process a little bit more simple. But yeah, it's tempting to to go much more than 6 and go up to like 9 or 10. But yeah, I think that would be my recommendation, is to try and like kind of group some commonalities amongst them together and try and satisfy that group with one messaging and then satisfied with another.
Maybe we could even, sorry, now see, I'm asking everybody today. If you have like say as many as 9, you could also group them by hesitancy rate. So if you're using it for like an HR perspective, sorry, I don't want to call anybody out. Shay, I know you just have to be the one that has, but it's like, and also if anyone's on the call, please don't feel called out. But you know, that we may have a step-by-step group, right? A group that is in places of hesitancy, but you know, not too much. And then we may have an absolute no-go group, right? And then how do we find those levels of accord between those two groups by those archetypes, right? I think that's I think that could work too. I'm like, now I want to like do this with like 9.
Yeah. More exercises for it.
Oh, well, just knowing that we are at 5 p.m. If there are any other questions, I'm sure we can fit in at least 1 or 2. But in the meantime, if not, that is okay as well. Oh, thanks, Shay. Okay, so it looks like people are signing off. So I just want to say thank you again, everybody, for spending some time with us and asking questions, taking these things into consideration. For those of you who signed up through Eventbrite, on an external front, we'll be sending out the white paper to you. Please feel free to tear it apart, share it. You can also reach out to myself or any of the team. Again, I'm the director of strategy here, so you can always reach me at helen@thinkingbox.com. I'd love to talk to you about it and hear your feedback, get your opinion on it. And then for everybody else internally, like we will be sharing this also through Slack. So if you'd like to sit down and read it all in its entirety, we have it available to you. So again, I just wanted to say thank you so much to everybody for coming to join us. All times are uncertain. So let's navigate this together. None of us are smarter than all of us. Oh, can you tell which group I belong to? And on that note, thank you, everybody. I'm going to end the call now.